He grabbed her by the wrist so hard she dropped the tin cup, and nobody in that crowded mercantile moved a muscle. Not one man, not one woman, not even the boy stacking flour sacks in the corner. Caleb Rourke yanked Rosalie toward the door like she was a mule he'd paid for, and when she stumbled and nearly fell, he didn't slow down. He just tightened his grip. Her face went white. Her lips pressed together the way a person's do when they've learned that crying only makes things worse. That was the moment everything changed. Not for Rosalie, who had been living inside that particular kind of hell for 3 years, but for a stranger standing near the back of the store who had walked in to buy rope and instead witnessed something that would cost him everything he had left. If you had been standing there, if that had been your sister, your daughter, your neighbor, what would you have done? If this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, somewhere you can't quite name, I want you to stay with me until the very end. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The auction had lasted 11 minutes. Elias Crowder knew because he counted. He stood in the back of the crowd with his hat in his hands and watched strangers bid on the land his father had broken his back to build, the same land where Elias had learned to ride, to rope, to fail, and to try again. The auctioneer had a voice like a brass bell and no interest in sentiment. Numbers went up, a hand went down, and then it was over. Elias didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The debt had been real. The drought had been real. The banker who had called in the note 6 weeks early, well, that had been real too, in the particular way that injustice is always real, even when nobody in a position of power seems to notice. He walked to his horse, tied at the post outside the courthouse, and stood there for a moment with one hand resting on the saddle horn. His horse, a big sorrel named Cutter, turned his head and looked at him with the kind of patience that only animals and very old people seem to manage. "I know," Elias said. He was 41 years old. He had $312 in a leather pouch sewn into the lining of his coat. He had a horse, a rifle, a bedroll, and a saddle that needed new stitching on the left fender. He had no wife, no children, and as of 11 minutes ago, no land. What he did have was a piece of paper. A man named Garrett Finch had approached him 2 weeks earlier, right after word got out that the Crowder place was going to auction. Finch was a land agent, the kind who always seemed to appear at the worst possible moment in a man's life, like flies around something dead. He had a soft handshake and a practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes, and he offered Elias a solution. There was a cabin, he said, remote, up in the pine country, about 4 days' ride northeast. The previous owner had died intestate. No family, no heirs, just a piece of property sitting unclaimed in the county records. Finch had the authority to sell it for back taxes. The price was $280. Elias asked why it was so cheap. Finch said the location was inconvenient. Elias asked if there was something wrong with it. Finch said he'd never seen it personally, only had it described to him in a survey report from 8 years back. Elias looked at the man for a long moment. He knew he was probably being taken. He knew the cabin could be a ruin, a hole in the ground, nothing but a stone foundation and a caved-in roof with raccoons living inside. He knew that paying nearly all of his remaining money for something he'd never laid eyes on was the kind of decision a desperate man makes, and that desperate men make bad decisions. He bought it anyway. The paper said the cabin sat on 43 acres of timbered land in the foothills, with a creek running along the eastern edge of the property. It said there was a barn, or at least there had been a barn. It said the cabin itself was 16 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace on the north wall. Elias folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket next to the deed, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that he was riding toward a place he'd never seen to start a life he couldn't yet imagine. The first day's ride was through country he knew. Familiar hills, familiar scrub oak, familiar dust. Emad camped that night near a creek he'd watered cattle at a dozen times over the years, and he sat by his fire and ate cold beans from a can and thought about his brother Nathan, who had died 7 months ago under circumstances the sheriff called unclear and which Elias had never fully accepted. Nathan had been working a small spread about 60 miles east. He'd written Elias a letter 2 weeks before he died, a letter that arrived 3 days after the funeral, saying he was having trouble with a man named Rourke. That the man had offered to buy his land twice and been refused twice and hadn't taken the second refusal well. Nathan had written that he wasn't worried, that he could handle it, the way men always write when they're trying not to worry someone they love. Then he was dead. Horse threw him, they said. Found him at the bottom of a ravine. Elias had ridden to the scene himself, had looked at the ravine, had looked at the horse, had looked at the rocky slope where his brother supposedly lost his seat. Nathan Crowder had been riding horses since he was 4 years old. He had never been thrown in his life. Not once. The sheriff had looked at Elias with something between sympathy and impatience and said that accidents happen to even the best riders, and that without witnesses there wasn't much that could be done. Elias had said nothing because he understood that saying something would require proof, and he had none. He sat by his fire that second night on the trail and turned Nathan's silver watch over in his fingers. It was the only thing of his brother's he had, given to him at the funeral by a neighbor who said Nathan had asked him to hold on to it. The watch had stopped working. The hands were frozen at 4:17. Elias had tried to wind it and nothing caught. He didn't know if that meant anything or not. He put it in his breast pocket, close to where his heart was, and tried to sleep. The third day the country changed. The scrub gave way to pines, real pines, tall and straight, with the kind of silence underneath them that city people sometimes find peaceful and frontier people find something closer to watchful. The trail narrowed, the air cooled. Elias found himself checking the paper more often, looking for the landmarks Finch had described from the survey. A split boulder, a dry wash, a ridge that ran north to south with a notch cut in the top like a missing tooth. He found the notch late in the afternoon of the fourth day and followed the ridge until the trail bent east and dropped down into a shallow valley. The pines thinned. A creek appeared on his right, silver and cold-looking, moving quickly over smooth stones. And there, set back against the tree line with its back to the hill and its face to the clearing, was the cabin. It was in better shape than he'd feared. The roof looked solid. The walls were hewn logs, gray with age but still tight. Someone had built this place to last, and it had lasted. What Elias had not expected was smoke, a thin thread of it rising from the chimney, pale gray against the darker sky, curling up and disappearing into the pines. He stopped Cutter at the edge of the clearing and sat very still for a moment. His hand moved toward the rifle in its scabbard, then stopped. He didn't know what this was yet. Could be a trapper, passing through, using an empty cabin for a night's shelter. That was common enough in remote country. Could be someone who didn't know the cabin had been sold. Could be someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. He dismounted, tied Cutter to a branch at the tree line, and walked toward the cabin door. He could smell the smoke more clearly now. And something else. Something that stopped him in his tracks about 10 feet from the door. Bread. Freshly baked bread. The smell of it warm and impossible against the cold mountain air, slipping out through the gap between the door and the frame. Elias stared at the door like it had said something to him. Someone had been here long enough to bake bread. This was not a trapper stopping for one night. This was someone who had been here a while. Someone who had made this place into something like a home. He knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then a sound. The particular sound of someone trying very hard not to make any sound. He knocked again. "I bought this property," he said, his voice coming out more tired than threatening. "I have the deed. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know who's inside." Silence. Then very quietly, a voice came through the door. A woman's voice, low and careful, like someone choosing every word before they let it go. "Are you alone?" The question hit him somewhere unexpected. Not because it was strange to ask. It was a reasonable question, a smart question actually, for anyone who had reason to be cautious. But the way she asked it, the specific weight in those 3 words. That wasn't the wariness of a trespasser caught in the act. That was something older and heavier. "Yes," he said. "I'm alone." Another silence. Then the sound of a bar being lifted on the other side of the door. The latch moved. The door swung inward. She was not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he had expected. Some weathered mountain woman, maybe, or an old hermit's widow. But not this. She was younger than him, somewhere in her early 30s, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and eyes that were neither blue nor gray, but somewhere between the two. the kind of color that changed depending on the light. She held herself very still, the way prey animals hold still when they're deciding whether to run. She was also visibly pregnant. Elias took all of this in within the span of 3 seconds and had the sense not to let most of what he was thinking show on his face. "Rosalie Vane," she said. Not a question. She was telling him her name the way someone hands you something fragile, carefully, with both hands, watching your face. "Elias Crowder," he said. "You really bought this place?" "I did." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes moved to his hands, to his hip where the revolver sat, to the tree line behind him, back to his face. She was cataloging him the way a person does when they've had reason to be very careful about the men they encounter. "I can show you the deed," he said. "I believe you." She stepped back from the door, not exactly an invitation, but a permission. "Come in, then." He stepped inside. The fire was low but steady, throwing warm orange light across rough-hewn walls hung with nothing but a single coat and a small mirror. The table held a loaf of bread still steaming slightly, and a tin cup, and a candle burned down to a stub. The bed in the corner was made up with a patchwork quilt that didn't match anything else in the cabin and looked like something brought from somewhere else, from a different life. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 weeks, she said. "Alone?" "Yes." He looked around the cabin. It was clean. She had worked to make it clean. The floor swept, the ashes removed from the hearth, and replaced with fresh wood, the windows, small as they were, wiped clear of grime. Whatever else was true about this woman, she had not been sitting idle. "There's bread," she said, a little stiffly, like the word hospitality was something she had to locate and dust off. "I baked this morning. You can have some." "Thank you," he said, and meant it, because he hadn't eaten since yesterday noon. He sat down at the table and she cut him a thick slice and stood with her back against the wall while he ate it. She didn't eat. She watched the door. "You're waiting for someone," he said. Not accusing, just saying what he saw. Her jaw tightened. "I'm hoping no one comes." "Is there a difference?" Something moved across her face, something brief and complicated and almost rueful, the ghost of what might have been a dark laugh in a different life. "Not really," she said. Elias finished the bread and set down the cup and looked at her directly for the first time without the pretense of looking elsewhere. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he said. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the door again, and that was when they both heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming down the valley at a pace that wasn't casual, coming fast, coming with purpose. Rosalie's face changed. The color drained out of it so quickly and completely that Elias was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. "How many?" he asked. Her voice, when it came, was barely a sound at all. 3, maybe 4. A pause. "He found me." Elias crossed to the window in 2 steps and looked out through the small, wavy glass. 3 riders, coming across the clearing. The man in the front was big, broad across the shoulders, riding a black horse with the kind of easy authority that some men wear like a second skin. He had his hat pushed back and his face was visible even at this distance, square-jawed, clean-shaven, with the expression of a man who has never in his life expected to not get what he came for. Elias had never seen him before, but he recognized him. He recognized the type. Had known men like this his whole life, men who understood the world as a simple equation with themselves on one side and everything else on the other, and who had never been given serious reason to question that arithmetic. "Is that him?" Elias said. "Rourke?" "Yes," Rosalie whispered. Elias looked at the door. He looked at the woman behind him. He thought very briefly about the $312, now 280-odd, and the deed in his coat pocket, and the 43 acres outside, and the creek on the eastern edge, and all the things he'd been planning to do with what little remained of his life. Then he looked at Rosalie Vane's face and made a decision. He walked to the door and opened it, and stepped out onto the narrow porch before the riders reached the cabin, and he stood there with his thumbs in his belt and his feet planted the way his father had taught him to stand when he wanted someone to understand that he intended to stay where he was. Caleb Rourke reined his horse to a stop 15 feet away. The 2 men behind him stopped as well. One was young, barely more than a boy, with nervous hands. The other was older, heavy through the middle, with eyes that moved the way a wolf's eyes move, always checking exits. Rourke looked at Elias the way you look at something you're deciding whether to move or step over. "Who are you?" he said. "Elias Crowder. I own this property." Rourke's mouth moved in something that had the shape of a smile without the warmth. "You're in my way," he said. "I reckon I am," said Elias. And that was how it started. Caleb Rourke didn't get down off his horse right away. That was the first thing Elias noticed. A man who was genuinely confident in his position would have dismounted, would have walked over, maybe offered a hand, played at being reasonable before showing his teeth. Rourke stayed in the saddle, which meant he was calculating something, weighing how much force he needed, deciding whether Elias was the kind of problem that required effort or just volume. Elias kept his hands where they were, thumbs in his belt, and waited. "You said you own this property," Rourke said, finally. His voice was the kind of voice that had been used to being the loudest one in every room it had ever been in. Not shouting, he didn't need to shout. Just carrying, the way a church bell carries, without apology. "I do," Elias said. "Who'd you buy it from?" "Land agent by the name of Finch. Property was sold for back taxes." Rourke turned his head slightly and said something to the heavy man on his left, too low for Elias to catch. The heavy man made a sound in his throat that might have been a laugh. "Finch," Rourke said, turning back. "That weasel sold you 40 acres of rock and timber, and you think that gives you the right to stand on that porch and tell me I can't go inside?" "I'm not telling you anything," Elias said. "I'm just standing here. Same thing." "If you say so." Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Really looked at him, the way men like Rourke look at things. Not to understand them, but to measure them. To find the soft place, the crack in the foundation, the spot where pressure would produce results. Whatever he found in Elias Crowder's face, it didn't seem to satisfy him. He swung down off the horse then, moved toward the porch with the unhurried ease of a man who had never in his life walked toward a situation he expected to lose. He stopped at the bottom of the 2 wooden steps and looked up at Elias. Close enough now that Elias could see the small scar running through his left eyebrow, and the way his jaw set when he wasn't talking, tight and grinding, like something was always working behind his face that his expression was doing its best to hide. "The woman inside," Rourke said. "Her name's Rosalie. She's my wife." Elias said nothing. "We had a disagreement," Rourke continued, his tone shifting into something that wanted to sound like a reasonable husband explaining a private matter. "She left. That happens in marriages, I'm sure you understand. But she's carrying my child, and I have a legal right to bring her home." "She doesn't seem to want to go," Elias said. Something shifted in Rourke's face. Not anger, not yet. Something more controlled than that. Something that had learned to stay behind a closed door until the right moment. "What she wants," Rourke said, very quietly, "isn't really the question I came here to answer." That sentence landed in the cold air between them and sat there. Elias felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Somewhere in the chest, somewhere below thought. "I think it might be the only question that matters," Elias said. Rourke studied him. Then he put one boot on the bottom step. "Move," he said. "No." It was a simple word. 2 letters. Elias said it the way he might say it to a fence post he was trying to pull. Matter of fact, without drama, like the outcome had already been decided, and he was just waiting for the physical world to catch up to the fact of it. Rourke stopped with his boot on the step. His jaw worked. Behind him, the young rider shifted in his saddle, and the older one, the heavy man, moved his horse a half step to the right, which put him at a different angle to Elias. Flanking. Slow and casual, the kind of move that was meant to look like nothing. Elias clocked it without moving his head. "You have no idea," Rourke said, "what you're involving yourself in." "I'm starting to get one," Elias said. "This is not your business. She's not your woman. This land, whatever Finch put on that paper, is not worth what it's about to cost you if you don't step aside right now." "You keep telling me what things aren't," Elias said. "Why don't you tell me what they are?" That was when Rourke smiled. A real one this time, or at least realer than what had come before it. It didn't make him look friendlier. "All right," he said. He took his boot off the step and crossed his arms and seemed to settle into himself, like a man getting comfortable before telling a long story. "What this is simple. That woman in there has been under my protection for 3 years. I clothed her, fed her, gave her a name and a roof. Her family had nothing when I found her. Her father owed money to men who would have taken it out of her hide if I hadn't stepped in. I settled that debt. I made her my wife. And she thanked me by taking what I gave her and running. That's one way to tell it, a voice said. Both men looked. Rosalie was standing in the doorway. She'd come out without either of them hearing her, which told Elias something about how long she'd spent learning to move quietly. She held the door frame with one hand. She wasn't looking at Elias. She was looking at Rourke, and her face had changed from what it had been inside. The careful, watchful blankness was gone, replaced by something that had more iron in it than Elias would have predicted from a woman who'd looked so frightened 20 minutes ago. Rosalie. Rourke said her name the way you say a word you own, a thing, not a person. You settled my father's debt, she said, and then you spent the next 3 years reminding me of it every single day. Every time I did something wrong. Every time I said something you didn't like. Every time I wasn't what you needed me to be at exactly the moment you needed it. She paused. That's not a marriage, Caleb. That's a ledger. Rourke's voice dropped. Get in the house. This isn't your house. Rosalie. The word came out different this time, lower, with a specific weight to it that made Elias's hand move without thinking, fingers brushing the grip of the revolver at his hip. She said no, Elias said. Rourke turned his head back to Elias slowly, and when he looked at him this time, there was no more calculation in it. The reasonable husband performance was done. What was underneath it was something older and less complicated. The simple anger of a man who had never been refused anything and was deciding how much it was going to cost to get what he wanted. You got a deed to 40 acres, Rourke said. Good for you. You know what I've got? He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper of his own. Marriage certificate, filed in Harmon County, witnessed and notarized. He held it out, not toward Elias, but toward the open air between them, like evidence presented to a courtroom. The law says she's my wife. The law says that child she's carrying is mine. So whatever little rescue story you're writing in your head right now, the law is not on your side. Elias looked at the paper, then at Rourke. The law's 4 days' ride from here, he said. Rourke lowered the paper. His eyes went flat. Yes, he said, it is. Behind him, the young rider's hand had drifted toward the pistol at his belt. The heavy man had moved his horse another 3 feet to the right. They were spreading out, and doing it openly now, not bothering with the pretense of casual movement. Rourke had made his decision about what this was going to cost. Elias thought about the rifle inside the cabin. Too far. He thought about the revolver at his hip. 1 man, 3 targets, open ground. Those were numbers that didn't work in his favor, and then he thought about something his father had said to him once, when Elias was about 14 and had gotten himself into a schoolyard situation that looked similarly unwinnable. Don't fight the ground you're standing on, his father had said. Make them fight it instead. Before anyone does something they can't take back, Elias said, loud enough to carry. I want to ask you something, Rourke. Rourke said nothing, but he didn't move either, which was something. You rode 4 days to find her, 4 days through that country in this cold. You could have sent those 2 and stayed warm. Elias tilted his head toward the riders. But you came yourself. He let that sit for a second. Why? Rourke's jaw worked. Because she belongs to me. Men don't ride 4 days for something that belongs to them, Elias said. They ride 4 days for something they're afraid of losing. Those aren't the same thing. It was a gamble. He didn't fully know why he said it. Some instinct about the architecture of Rourke's particular vanity, some guess at where the crack in it was. And for just a moment, one single moment, he saw something move across Rourke's face that wasn't anger and wasn't calculation. Something raw and brief, like a door swinging open and being pulled shut again before you could see what was inside. Then it was gone. Get off my porch, Rourke said to Elias. No. Last time I'm saying it. I heard you the first time. Rourke looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Rosalie. Something passed between them, or rather, something went from Rourke toward Rosalie, a look that had the physical weight of a hand pressing down on a person's shoulders, and Elias watched Rosalie's hand tighten on the doorframe. You're going to regret this, Rourke said. Not to either of them specifically, to the situation, to the cold air and the pines and the mountain that didn't care one way or another. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, and the two riders turned with him, and for a moment Elias let himself breathe. Rourke mounted. He looked back once from the saddle. "I'll be back," he said. "And next time I won't knock." He turned the black horse and rode out of the clearing at a walk, deliberate and unhurried, the two men falling in behind him. Elias watched until they disappeared into the tree line on the far side of the creek, and then he watched the trees for another full minute, because men like Rourke sometimes came back through the woods while their horses kept making noise on the trail. The trees stayed still. He turned around. Rosalie was still standing in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and she was looking at the place where the riders had gone with an expression that had nothing triumphant in it. "He'll come back tonight," she said, "or tomorrow morning before first light. He always comes when you think he isn't coming." Elias stepped back up onto the porch. "How long have you been running from him?" She didn't answer immediately. She was still watching the tree line. 6 months, she said finally. "Since March. I left in the middle of the night with what I could carry in one bag." She glanced down at herself, at the visible weight of the child she was carrying. "I didn't know yet. About the baby. I found out 3 weeks after I left." "And the cabin?" "I'd heard of it. A trapper mentioned it to my father years ago, some empty place up in the pine country nobody went to. I remembered it. I had nowhere else to go." She looked at Elias then, directly, without apology. "I know I was trespassing." "You were surviving," he said. She seemed to consider whether to accept that. "I used your firewood," she said, "and there was some flour and salt left in a tin. I used that too." "You made bread," he said. "I think that balances out." That thing moved across her face again, the ghost of something that might have been a smile in better circumstances. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was the weight of what was actually happening. "He won't let this go," she said. "He doesn't let things go. It's not about me, Mr. Crowder. I need you to understand that. It's never been about me, not really. It's about the fact that I left, that I chose to leave. He can't allow that to exist in the world. The idea that someone chose something other than him." Elias leaned against the porch post and looked out at the clearing. The sun was getting low, throwing long shadows across the frost-stiff grass. "He mentioned a marriage certificate," he said. "It's real," she said, her voice going flat. "I signed it, though signed might be a generous word for what happened." She stopped. "My father had borrowed money from men who worked for Rourke. A lot of money, more than he could pay back. Caleb came to the house and told my father the debt would disappear if I married him. My father didn't tell me that was the arrangement until the morning of the ceremony." She said it without visible emotion, the way people say things they've had to say so many times that the words have worn smooth, lost their edges. "I was 29 years old. I should have refused. I've thought about that 1,000 times." "You were protecting your father," Elias said. "I thought I was." She put her free hand against her back, adjusting her weight. "Caleb paid the debt. Then he found 3 other ways to remake it. My father died 2 years ago, still owing money to Caleb Rourke. I don't know if that was an accident either." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said carefully. "Did he die under... Were the circumstances unclear?" She looked at him sharply. "Why do you ask it like that?" "My brother died 7 months ago," Elias said. "Horse threw him," they said. "He'd been having trouble with Rourke. Rourke wanted his land and Nathan wouldn't sell." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. "Nathan Crowder," Rosalie said slowly. Something was working behind her eyes. "East of Harmon County. The Crowder spread." "You knew him?" "I never met him." She hesitated, long enough that Elias could see her deciding something. "But I heard Caleb talking about a man who was being difficult, about how some problems had to be resolved permanently." She stopped. "I didn't know what it meant at the time, or I didn't let myself know. I didn't want to know." Elias's hands were very still at his sides. "When was this?" he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Last winter, January, maybe February." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry. I don't know what he did or what he ordered done. I only know what I heard." 7 months ago, Elias thought. Nathan died in February. He turned and looked out at the tree line again, but he wasn't seeing the pines anymore. He was seeing his brother's letter, the familiar handwriting going slightly crooked toward the end the way it did when Nathan was tired, and the words, "I'm having trouble with a man named Rourke." He'd known. He'd known since the day he stood at that ravine and looked at the slope and the horse and the whole tidy story of the accident and felt something in him refuse to accept it. He'd known the way you know a tooth is cracked before it actually breaks. The knowledge sitting quiet and aching below the surface of everything else. But knowing and having someone tell you are two entirely different things. "He killed my brother," Elias said. Not a question. Rosalie didn't answer directly. "I think," she said carefully, "that Caleb Rourke has done a great many things that no one has ever had to answer for. And I think that frightens him more than anything else. Not that someone will find out, but that someone won't. That he'll go on doing it forever and never face anything for it." It was a strange thing for her to say, and a perceptive one, and Elias looked at her with something like surprise, because he had not yet fully understood who he was dealing with. "We should get inside," she said. "He won't come back tonight, probably. He'll want to make a plan, but we need to be ready by morning." "What does ready look like?" Elias asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been figuring that out for 6 months." They went inside. Elias barred the door, checked the windows, 2 of them, small, the kind of windows built more for light than ventilation, which had the advantage of being hard to climb through. He checked his revolver. He checked the rifle, which was leaning against the wall near the door. An older Winchester, and when he picked it up, he looked at her questioningly. "It was already here," she said. "Left by whoever lived here before. I cleaned it. It shoots." "You tested it?" "Once. 3 weeks ago. At a tree stump, to make sure." She paused. "I hadn't fired a gun since I was a girl." "How'd you do?" "I hit the stump." "Good," he said. He found a spot near the front window where he could sit with his back to the wall and see both the window and the door without being directly in front of either. Rosalie rebuilt the fire and put a pot of water on. They ate bread and some dried venison she'd managed to put up, and a few boiled potatoes from a small sack she'd traded for at a settlement 2 days' ride south, paying with the last piece of jewelry she'd owned. They didn't talk much during the meal. But it wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was the particular quiet of 2 people in a difficult situation who have mutually agreed, without saying so, to think rather than speak. After a while, Rosalie said, "What did you plan to do with this place, before you opened the door and found it occupied?" Elias turned his cup in his hands. "Thought I'd fix up the barn first. Maybe run some cattle in the spring. Small herd, nothing ambitious. Plant a garden along the south side of the clearing where the sun stays longest." He stopped. "Thought I'd try to start over." "From what?" He told her about the ranch, about the drought and the debt and the banker and the 11 minutes. He told it plainly, without self-pity, because self-pity was something he had specifically decided not to indulge after the second night camping by himself on the road northeast with nothing but a tin of cold beans and Nathan's broken watch. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. "I'm sorry about your land," she said when he finished. "Land is land," he said. "My father used to say that. I used to think it meant land wasn't important. I think now it means something else. That land is replaceable in a way that people aren't." She looked at him. "Your brother?" "Yeah." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound like distant water. The fire popped. A log settled. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About Rourke, about what I told you." "I don't know yet," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he was tired of carrying things without putting them down, "I've known for 7 months that something wasn't right about how Nathan died. I've had no proof, no witnesses, no one willing to say anything." He looked at her steadily. "You're the first person who's told me anything at all." She absorbed that. "I didn't see anything directly," she said. "If it came to a legal situation, I don't know how much use I'd be." "Right now I'm not thinking about legal situations," he said. "Right now I'm thinking about 3 armed men who are going to come back at first light." She nodded. "There's something else." She said it the way someone says there's something else when the something else is the thing they've been sitting with all evening and finally decided to say. "Caleb has more men. Not just those 2. He has people spread through this whole region, men who owe him, men he pays, men who are afraid of him. Those 3 who came today are only the ones he brought for a quick job." She paused. "If this doesn't resolve quickly, quietly, If it becomes something that takes more than a day or two, he'll send for more. Elias considered that. How many more? I don't know exactly. 8, maybe 10. He looked at the fire for a long moment. All right, he said. All right? She sounded uncertain whether that was acceptance or dismissal. All right, he repeated. One problem at a time, tomorrow morning first. Whatever comes after, we figure out after. He looked at her. You should try to sleep. I'll take the first watch. You can't watch all night. I don't plan to. Wake me in 4 hours. She looked at him with that same direct measuring look she'd given him at the door, the cataloging look, checking his hands and his face and whatever else she used to read a person. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, or at least not alarm her. You don't have to stay, she said. This isn't your fight. Not yet. You could take your horse and ride out and come back after it's settled. It became my fight, he said, when he told me to move and I said no. She was quiet. And besides, he said, and he wasn't entirely sure why he said the next part, maybe because it was dark and the fire was low and he was tired and had no one to say things to anymore. My brother didn't deserve what happened to him, and you didn't deserve what happened to you, and I'm already here. Rosalie Vane looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and went to the bed in the corner and lay down with her back to the room, fully dressed, one hand tucked under her cheek, the patchwork quilt pulled up over her shoulder. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. He sat with his back against the wall, the revolver in his lap, and watched the window and the door and listened to the wind in the pines, and thought about Nathan, and thought about Rourke, and thought about the silver watch in his breast pocket with its hands frozen at 4:17, and whatever that meant or didn't mean. He thought about the moment at the clearing when he'd stepped out onto the porch before the riders arrived, when he'd made the choice without quite having the time to talk himself out of it, and he tried to locate the exact feeling of that moment, not to glorify it, but to understand it, because it had surprised him, the ease of it, the way the decision had come without the usual grinding weight of calculation. He thought maybe it was because he'd already lost everything once, and a man who has already lost everything once has a different relationship with risk. He didn't sleep. At 4 a.m, by the rough reckoning of the stars through the cabin window, Rosalie woke on her own and came and sat across from him without being asked. She'd found an extra blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat with her knees drawn up as much as the child would allow, her eyes quiet and awake. Anything? She said softly. Nothing. She nodded. Get some sleep, she said. He did. He woke 2 hours later to gray light coming through the window and the sound of Rosalie's voice, low and steady, saying his name. Not in alarm, or rather, in a kind of alarm that had gone very still, the way alarm sometimes does when the worst thing has actually arrived and the time for panic is behind you. They're in the tree line, she said. Elias was on his feet with the revolver in his hand before the last word was out. He moved to the window and looked. 3 horses, same as before, but different positions, one at the tree line east of the cabin, one near the creek, one directly across the clearing. They'd spread out. They'd thought about this overnight and come back with a different geometry. And Caleb Rourke was walking across the clearing on foot, alone, no weapon visible, with his hands slightly away from his sides and his hat in one hand, a posture that on anyone else might have read as peaceful, but on Rourke read as theater. He stopped about 30 feet from the door. Crowder, he called, come out and talk. Just talk. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Elias looked at Rosalie. She was standing against the wall, the Winchester in her hands, her face set in the expression of someone who has made a decision they've been approaching for a long time. What do you want to do? She said quietly. Elias checked the revolver, checked the load, looked at the window, at the positions of the 3 horses, at the geometry of the clearing in the early gray light, and thought about the math one more time. Then he crossed to the door and opened it. All right, he said to Rourke across the cold morning air. Let's talk. Rourke smiled. And behind that smile, Elias saw it clearly now. The thing that had been working behind his face since the moment they'd first looked at each other. Not just anger, not just possessiveness, something more specific, something pointed and personal. This man knew exactly who Elias Crowder was, and he had been waiting for this moment a great deal longer than yesterday afternoon. Rourke walked toward the porch like a man arriving at a business meeting he'd already decided the outcome of. That smile stayed on his face the whole way across the clearing. Not warm, not friendly, just present, the way a scar is present. Something that had settled into the geography of his face and stopped meaning anything specific a long time ago. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, same place as the day before, and looked up at Elias with the particular patience of a man who had learned that patience was its own kind of pressure. "You slept here," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. "It's my cabin," Elias said. "So you keep saying." Rourke glanced past him at the closed door. "Is she listening?" "Probably." Rourke nodded, as if that was fine with him, as if he wanted her to hear. "Then let's not waste each other's time." He put one boot on the step again. That same habit, that same incremental claim of space, testing to see if the boundary had moved overnight. Elias didn't move. Rourke's boot stayed where it was. "Here's what I'm offering," Rourke said. "One time. This is not a negotiation that repeats itself." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded square of paper, different from the marriage certificate, smaller, thicker. He held it out toward Elias. "Take it." Elias didn't move to take it. Rourke shrugged and unfolded it himself, turned it so Elias could read it. It was a banker's draft. Elias looked at the number written on it and felt something move through him that he didn't want to feel. Because the number was significant. More than the cabin had cost. More than he had left in the world. Enough to buy decent land, start a real herd, make a genuine beginning rather than the desperate improvised version he'd been working with. "That's for the deed," Rourke said. "You sign the property over to me, you ride south, you never come back to this valley. I don't care where you go or what you do with the money. That's your business." "And Rosalie," Elias said. "Rosalie is my wife and my concern and has nothing to do with the price of your land." "She has everything to do with why I'm not taking that paper," Elias said. Rourke refolded the draft slowly and put it back in his coat. The smile didn't change. "All right. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He tilted his head slightly. "What do you actually know about her?" Elias said nothing. "You met her yesterday afternoon," Rourke said. "She made you bread and told you a sad story, and you decided she was worth dying for. That's either very noble or very stupid, and I don't think you're a stupid man." He paused. "She's good at stories. She's been telling them her whole life. Her father was the same way. Charming man, Hector Vane, could talk water uphill. Also owed money to half the county and drank himself into an early grave. He said it without heat, just laying it out like evidence. She left me. Fine. People leave. What she took with her is another matter." "What did she take?" Elias said. "Information," Rourke said. "Things she heard in my house, conversations she was not part of and not meant to hear. Things that, in the wrong hands, could cause me considerable inconvenience." There it was. Elias had wondered, overnight, sitting against the wall in the dark, why Rourke had come himself. Why a man with 8 or 10 men at his disposal had ridden 4 days through cold country to collect a runaway wife personally. And now he had the shape of it. It wasn't about the child. It wasn't even really about the principle of the thing, though the principle mattered to Rourke the way it matters to all men who cannot tolerate being chosen against. It was about what she knew. "She told me about my brother," Elias said. Something happened in Rourke's face. It wasn't dramatic. Not a flinch, not a step back. Just a very slight adjustment, the eyes going a fraction flatter, the jaw a fraction tighter, like a machine taking on a heavier load. "Nathan Crowder," Elias said. "She heard you talking, last winter, about a man who was being difficult, about problems being resolved permanently." Rourke was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Your brother had an accident," he said. "I was sorry to hear it. Were you?" "A man his age riding alone in rough country." "He'd been riding rough country since he was 4, Elias said. "He was never thrown in his life." "There's a first time for everything." "And a last time," Elias said. "Who did it? Was it you personally, or did you send someone?" The question hung in the cold morning air between them, and for just a moment, just a single brief moment, Rourke didn't answer, and that silence was its own kind of answer. "You're making an accusation," Rourke said, his voice dropping into something careful and lawyerly, "that you can't support with anything but the word of a woman who has every reason to say whatever damages me most." "Maybe," Elias said, "but I've known since February that something wasn't right, and now I know your name, and I know your face, and I know where to find you." You're threatening me. Rourke sounded almost impressed. I'm telling you how things are, Elias said. Same way you told me how things are yesterday. Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past Elias at the cabin door, and his expression did something complicated, a kind of tired contempt that wasn't entirely without its own private grief, if grief was even the right word for whatever passed through Caleb Rourke's face when he thought about the woman inside. I'll tell you something true, Rourke said, and you can do with it what you want. He stepped back off the step, putting distance between them, settling his hat back on his head. That child she's carrying, it's mine, I know that. She knows that, and I want it. Not because I'm a family man, I'm not going to insult your intelligence with that, but because that child is leverage. It's always been leverage. The difference is that now she's got her own kind of leverage, and she knows it, and that makes her dangerous to me in a way she wasn't before. Elias stared at him. You just told me your wife and your unborn child are nothing but tools to you, he said. I told you the truth, Rourke said. Most men wouldn't. I'm giving you the respect of honesty. He paused. The question is what you're going to do with it. Step off my property, Elias said. That's what I'm going to do with it. Rourke laughed. A real laugh, short and dry, with something almost like genuine amusement in it. You are either the most stubborn man I have ever encountered or the most reckless. I'm honestly not sure which. Probably both, Elias said. The amusement left Rourke's face as quickly as it had arrived. I'm going to give you until noon, he said. Same offer. The draft is good. Ride south and don't look back. He looked at the cabin one more time, and his voice went very quiet. After noon, the offer goes away, and what comes after won't have anything to do with money. He turned and walked back across the clearing toward the trees. The two riders waited at their positions, east of the cabin, near the creek, and Rourke walked past them without stopping, mounted the black horse, and all three of them disappeared back into the pines. Elias stood on the porch until he couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then he went inside. Rosalie was standing in the middle of the room with the Winchester across her forearms and her face very still. She had heard. He could tell by the way she held herself, not tense exactly, but gathered, the way a person holds themselves when they've just had something confirmed that they already knew but had hoped not to. He told you, she said. Some of it. The leverage part. Yes. She looked at the rifle in her hands. I've known for a long time that's what the baby was to him. I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept finding reasons to think maybe it was more complicated than that. She set the rifle against the wall. It isn't. It never was. Elias sat down at the table. His legs were tired. He hadn't slept enough, and the cold had gotten into his joints overnight. And he was aware, in a way he hadn't been yesterday, that he was 41 years old and had been living on bad food and insufficient rest for the better part of a year. He's going to come back at noon, he said, or something is going to happen at noon. Either way, noon is the thing. I know. How far to the nearest town with any law in it? Mill Haven, she said, south and east. 3 days? Maybe 4, depending on the trail. She paused. I came that way. The trail through the pass is faster, but it's narrow, and you couldn't move quickly on it. 3 days. Rourke had given them 3 hours. Elias turned Nathan's watch over in his fingers without thinking about it. He'd taken it out at some point during the night without realizing, and it had been in his hand ever since. The hand still frozen at 4:17, the case worn smooth where Nathan had carried it. What's in the watch? He looked up. Rosalie was watching him with that direct look, the one that saw more than it let on. Nothing, he said. It doesn't work. Nathan carried it. She was quiet for a moment, then, Can I see it? He handed it to her. She turned it over in her fingers the way he had, examining the case, the worn places, the hinges. Then she looked at the seam around the edge of the back panel and said, without particular drama, This opens. I know, the movement's exposed when you... No, she said, not the movement side, the other way. She turned it over and pressed her thumbnail against a point on the edge of the back panel that Elias had never noticed. A slightly different quality to the metal there, a faint line he'd taken for a seam in the casing. The back panel opened. Not the regular access panel for the movement, the outer case, which was thicker than standard, and behind it was a second very shallow space that Elias had not known existed. Inside was a piece of paper, folded so small it had been cut down to fit, the size of his palm when she unfolded it carefully, the creases deep and the paper soft from being folded and refolded many times. She handed it to him. He spread it on the table with both hands and looked at it. It was a map, hand-drawn in Nathan's careful small handwriting, with compass directions marked and distances noted in paces. A trail heading into the mountains north of what looked like Harmon County, marked with landmarks Elias didn't immediately recognize. A split rock, a dry creek bed, something Nathan had labeled only as the overhang, and at the end of the trail marked with a small precise X, 2 words, "Everything here." Elias stared at it. He knew, Elias said. Not to Rosalie, not to anyone, just to the map. He knew something was coming and he hid it. Hid what? Rosalie said. I don't know yet. He looked up at her. But Nathan was careful. He was the careful one between us, always had been. If he made a map and hid it inside a watch, and made sure that watch got to me, he stopped. There's something up there, something he found or something he gathered, about Rourke. Rosalie sat down across from him slowly. She looked at the map. She looked at him. He could see her thinking, working through it the same way he was. If Nathan had been collecting evidence, she said slowly, and Rourke found out he had it, not just that Nathan wouldn't sell the land, but that he had proof of something. Then it wasn't just about the land, Elias said. No. Her voice had gone very quiet. It never would have been just about the land. They sat with that for a moment. I know these mountains, she said finally. Not well, but some. The Split Rock. There's one about a day's ride north up the secondary trail past the cabin. I saw it when I was scouting the area after I arrived here. She tapped the map. The distances Nathan marked. If you start from the cabin, this isn't more than a day's ride. A day there, Elias said, and Rourke is coming back at noon. Then you can't go, she said. Not you. Not now. He looked at her. I can't go either, she said before he could say it. I know. I'm not suggesting that. She pressed her lips together. What I'm saying is that the map doesn't help us in the next 3 hours. What's on that mountain stays on the mountain until we've dealt with what's in that clearing. She was right. He knew she was right and didn't like it, and folded the map and put it in his breast pocket next to where he'd had the watch, closer to him now than anything else he owned. All right, he said. Noon. What does noon look like? Rosalie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured, deliberate, and he understood that she'd been thinking about this longer than just this morning. Caleb will want it clean, she said. He won't want a prolonged thing, not here, not on someone else's property with witnesses possibly within earshot. He likes things that can be explained. An accident, a misunderstanding, a man who bought a cabin and got in over his head and took the wrong side of a bad situation. She paused. He'll offer you the gunfight. He's done it before. He's fast, and he knows it, and he's very good at making the other man feel like he's being offered a chance when really he's being offered a choice between 2 kinds of losing. You've seen him do it, Elias said. Once, she said, a farmer named Coles, about 18 months before I left. Coles had a water right that Caleb wanted. Caleb offered to buy it, Coles refused, and Caleb challenged him in front of witnesses and shot him in a fair fight. Legally, no charges filed. She stopped. It wasn't a fair fight. Caleb had been practicing for that specific day for 3 weeks. He knew Coles would refuse, knew he'd accept the challenge because Coles was a proud man, and he planned it from the beginning. She looked at Elias steadily. He's going to offer you the same thing, and I'm telling you not to take it. If I don't take it, he'll do something else, Elias said. Yes, but something else gives us more time, more options. The gunfight gives you one option, win or die. Elias was quiet. He understood her reasoning, and it was sound reasoning, and he was also running the calculation of what 3 hours gave them versus what saying no to the gunfight gave them, and the numbers on both sides were bad. What do you know about the 2 men with him? He asked. Denny Marsh, the heavy one. He's been with Caleb for years. Loyal, not because he respects him, but because Caleb pays better than anyone else and Marsh doesn't have anywhere else to go. He won't act without instruction. She considered. The younger one? I don't know. He's new. He looked nervous yesterday. He was nervous, Elias confirmed. Nervous men do stupid things, she said. That's not better, necessarily. It's just different. The morning moved. The sun came up over the ridge and threw slanted light across the clearing, and the frost on the grass began to let go, and the creek along the eastern edge of the property made its cold, ongoing sound, and Elias sat at the table in thought, and Rosalie sat across from him in thought, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there wasn't much left to say until noon arrived and showed them what it had brought. At some point, Rosalie got up and added wood to the fire and made coffee. Real coffee, the last she had, grounds wrapped in a cloth and boiled in the tin pot. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat back down. He drank it. It was too hot and too bitter, and it was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. "My daughter," Rosalie said suddenly, not looking at him. "I keep thinking it's a girl. I don't know that, I keep thinking it." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I want her to grow up somewhere she can make noise. Is that a strange thing to say?" He looked at her. "I was so quiet," she said. "For 3 years I was so quiet. Quiet at the table, quiet in the yard, quiet when I was frightened, and quiet when I was angry, and quiet when he—" She stopped. "I don't want her to be quiet like that. I want her to cry when she needs to cry, and shout when she needs to shout, and have the room to do those things without anyone punishing her for taking up space." Elias thought about what to say to that, and came up empty, and so he said nothing, just drank his coffee, and Rosalie seemed to understand that as sufficient. The hands on the wall clock, there was a small one, cheap, ticking on a nail above the fireplace, moved toward noon. At 5 minutes to 12, Elias stood up and checked his revolver one more time and checked his spare cylinder and put on his coat. "Stay inside," he said. "I'm not going to stay inside," she said. "Rosalie, if you tell me to stay inside and bar the door," she said, not raising her voice, "you are making the same mistake that every person in my life has made, which is deciding that what they think is safe for me is more important than what I decide for myself." She picked up the Winchester. "I'll stay back. I won't do anything unless there's a reason to. But I'm not going to be on the other side of a door while you're out there." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Stay on the porch, behind the post." "Fine. And if things go bad, you run. Through the back, into the trees, north along the creek. You don't stop." "Elias, promise me." She met his eyes. "I promise I'll do what needs to be done. That's the best I can give you." It wasn't what he'd asked for. He took it anyway. He went out first. The clearing was still, the midday light flat and pale through a thin layer of cloud that had moved in while they were inside. He walked to the center of the clearing, which was where men like Rourke expected you to be, and he stood and waited. They came out of the tree line at noon exactly. All 3 of them, on horseback, moving across the grass at a slow walk. Rourke in the center, Marsh on his left, the young one whose name Elias still didn't know on his right. They stopped about 40 feet away, and Rourke swung down off the black horse and handed the reins to Marsh, and walked forward until there was 20 feet between himself and Elias. "You didn't ride south," Rourke said. "No," Elias said. Rourke looked past him at the porch, where Rosalie stood behind the wooden post with the Winchester in her hands. Something went through his face when he saw her. Anger, yes, but also something else, something Elias could not name. "Put that down, Rosalie," Rourke said. "No," she said. Rourke looked back at Elias. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture that might have been meant to look like openness. "Here's where we are," Rourke said. "You declined the money. You're not leaving. I'm not leaving. That means this gets settled here." He tilted his head toward the 2 riders. "I can have them rush that cabin right now. I'd rather not. It's messy, and you'd probably take one of them with you, which I don't want to spend. But I can." He paused. "Or we settle it between us. 1-on-1. You win, we ride out. Simple." There it was, exactly as Rosalie had said it would be. Elias looked at him. He thought about what Rosalie had told him. The farmer named Coles, the 3 weeks of practice, the engineered situation. He thought about what she'd said about not taking the challenge, about other options. And then Rourke said something that changed the arithmetic of the entire morning. "You want to know why I'm here myself?" Rourke said. His voice went different, not quieter, but emptied of the performance, the lawyerly patience, the reasonable man mask, just the voice underneath all of that. "You want to know why I rode 4 days instead of sending men?" Elias waited. "Because your brother came to me," Rourke said, 3 weeks before he died. Came to my house, sat at my table, and he told me he knew things. He had papers, he said, records of land transactions, witness statements, things that would see me brought up on criminal charges if they went to the right people. Rourke looked at him steadily. He wanted me to leave, just pack up and leave the county. He wasn't asking for money, wasn't asking for anything except for me to go. Elias felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What did you do?" he said. "I told him I'd think about it," Rourke said. "I told him to give me a week." He paused. A week later, he had his accident. He said it simply, flatly. Not as a confession, as a demonstration, a proof of something. He was telling Elias this on purpose, in the open, in front of his own men and Rosalie Vane, and the reason he was telling it was precisely because he believed there was nothing Elias could do with it. No witnesses who'd speak, no law close enough to matter, no way to turn this information into anything except grief. He was showing Elias what he was because he had done it before and gotten away with it and expected to get away with it again. And he wanted Elias to understand the full dimensions of what he was dealing with before the gunfight so that the fear of it would be present in Elias's hands when the moment came. Elias stood very still. He thought about Nathan sitting at Rourke's table. His brother, who had always been the careful one, the one who thought things through, who had spent months gathering whatever he'd gathered and then made one catastrophic miscalculation, believing that showing Rourke the evidence would be enough, believing that a man like Rourke, faced with proof of his own crimes, would choose to leave rather than eliminate the proof. Nathan had underestimated him. Elias was not going to make the same mistake. "You murdered my brother," Elias said. "Your brother had an accident," Rourke said pleasantly. "And the papers he told you about, the records, you never found them." Something very small moved in Rourke's eyes. "No," he said, "I never found them." And then, after a pause so brief you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it, "Did he tell you where they were?" There it was. The real reason Rourke had come himself. The real reason he'd offered the money. Not to buy Elias off, but to get him to leave the property without Rourke having to go through it. The real reason he was standing in this clearing having this conversation instead of simply sending Marsh and the boy to burn the cabin to the ground. He thought Nathan's papers might be here, and he couldn't burn the place down until he knew whether they were. Elias looked at him and said nothing. "You know where they are?" Rourke said. It wasn't a question anymore. "I know a lot of things," Elias said. Rourke's face changed. Not slowly, not by degrees. Just changed. The way weather changes. The thin patience snapping under its own weight, and what was underneath it was something Elias recognized from the hard years and the bad men he'd encountered, something that had no more room in it for calculation or theater. "Draw," Rourke said. "I haven't agreed to your terms," Elias said. "I'm not asking for your agreement anymore." Rourke's hand dropped to the revolver at his hip and hung there, fingers loose, the practiced stillness of a man who has done this before and knows exactly how it goes. "Draw. Or I'll put a bullet in your chest where you stand and tell the sheriff you pulled first, and these two will swear to it." Behind Elias, from the porch, he heard Rosalie's sharp intake of breath. Behind Rourke, Marsh reached for his own weapon and the young rider went very still in the saddle, both hands up near the pommel. And Elias saw in that moment that the boy did not want to be here, had never wanted to be here, was sitting on that horse trying to be invisible in the way that very young men sometimes try to be invisible when they have finally understood what they've gotten themselves into. Elias looked at Rourke's hand, looked at his eyes, read the distance between thought and action in the set of his shoulder and the angle of his body. Then he drew. The clearing exploded with sound. Elias had been in 3 gunfights in his life before this one. He had not won all of them cleanly. He carried a scar along his left forearm from a man in Caldwell County who had been faster than him and less accurate, which was the particular combination of luck that had kept Elias alive. He was not the fastest man he'd ever encountered, and he was not foolish enough to believe otherwise. What he was accurate. Rourke was fast. Faster than Elias. The black revolver cleared its holster a quarter second before Elias's hand finished its motion, and the sound of Rourke's shot cracked across the clearing, and Elias felt the burn along his right side, just below the ribs. The specific fire of a bullet that had touched him without stopping. A graze, deep enough to bleed hard, not deep enough to drop him. He did not drop. His own shot took Rourke in the right shoulder, and he fired again before Rourke could adjust, and the second shot hit Rourke's gun hand and the revolver went spinning into the frost-dead grass, and Rourke went down to one knee with a sound that was not quite a yell and not quite a groan, something between the two, raw and unguarded in a way his voice had not been once in the entire preceding day. Marsh was moving. Elias heard him shout something and turned, and in the same moment heard the crack of the Winchester from the porch. And Marsh's horse lurched sideways, and Marsh grabbed the pommel and stayed in the saddle, but the shot had gone past his ear close enough to change his mind about everything. He pulled the horse around and rode for the tree line. The young rider had not moved. He sat on his horse with both hands very clearly visible, up near his chest now, not quite raised but close to it, his face white as new paper, looking at Rourke on the ground and at Elias standing bleeding in the middle of the clearing and making a very fast and very permanent decision about which side of the situation he wanted to be on. "Ride," Elias said to him. The boy rode. The clearing went quiet except for Rourke, who was on both knees now, his right hand bleeding into the grass, his left hand pressed against his shoulder, breathing through his teeth in the sharp, measured way of a man in serious pain trying to stay conscious. Elias crossed to him in 4 steps, picked up Rourke's revolver, and stepped back to a safe distance. His right side was burning, and he could feel the blood moving under his shirt, soaking into the waistband of his trousers. But the fire in his legs was still solid under him, and that was what mattered. Rourke looked up at him. His face had gone gray and wet, and what was left in his eyes was something Elias had not expected to see there. Not anger, not calculation, something lost. Something that had been using the anger and the calculation as a container and was now visible without them, small and confused and very old. "You should have taken the money," Rourke said. His voice was ragged at the edges. "You should have left my brother alone," Elias said. Rosalie came off the porch. She crossed the clearing quickly, the Winchester still in her hands, and she stopped 6 feet away from Rourke and looked down at him, and her face was... Elias watched it and couldn't find the word for it. Not triumphant, not relieved. Something more complicated and private than either of those things. "The records Nathan had," she said to Rourke. Not loudly. "The deeds, the agreements, the things he gathered about what you did to those families." She paused. "You never found them." Rourke looked at her. Some expression moved across his face. "No," he said. "They exist," she said. He stared at her. "I didn't know that," she said, "until this morning. But they exist. And now we know where they are." She glanced at Elias, a glance that carried the map in Nathan's watch without naming it, and looked back at Rourke. "Everything you did is documented. Everything. The lands you stole, the agreements you forged, the men you—" She stopped, steadied herself. "Nathan knew. And he made sure it couldn't disappear when he did." Rourke closed his eyes. In the silence that followed, somewhere across the valley, came a sound that none of them had expected. Hoofbeats. Not fast, not alarmed, steady, official, the sound of multiple horses moving at the deliberate pace of people who go where trouble is and are in no particular hurry because the trouble is not going anywhere. Elias looked toward the sound. Over the ridge to the south, moving down the switchback trail that he himself had ridden 4 days earlier, came 4 riders. The man in front wore a coat the color of mud and a badge that caught the flat midday light and threw a small wink of silver across the clearing. Rosalie made a sound beside him. Not quite a word, just a sound, short and compressed, the sound of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and felt it shift. Elias watched the riders come and felt the blood soaking steadily into his shirt and thought about Nathan's map in his breast pocket and the hidden space in the back of a silver watch, and his brother sitting at Caleb Rourke's table 3 weeks before he died, laying his cards down in front of the wrong man. Not the wrong cards, the wrong table. The sheriff's horse came down into the clearing at a walk, and the man in the mud-colored coat looked at Rourke on the ground, and at Elias standing bleeding, and at Rosalie with the Winchester, and at the empty clearing where 2 riders had been and were no longer, and he pulled his horse to a stop and looked at all of it with the unhurried expression of a man who had been doing this job long enough to stop being surprised by the arrangements he found at the end of hard rides. "I'm Walter Morrison," he said. "Sheriff, Harmon County." His eyes went to Rourke. "Somebody want to tell me what happened here?" Rourke said nothing. Elias looked at the sheriff and then at Rosalie, and felt the pain in his side beginning to announce itself more seriously now that the immediate emergency had passed. The way injuries always wait until you have a moment's peace before they remind you they're there. "It's a long story," Elias said. "Usually is," said Morrison. He dismounted. "I've got time." Sheriff Walter Morrison was not what Elias had expected. He was shorter than the badge suggested, compact and economical in his movements, with a gray mustache that had grown past the point of intention and a pair of eyes the color of creek water in October. Not unkind, not warm either, just clear and steady and taking everything in without visible reaction. He had the quality of a man who had decided a long time ago that the world was mostly trouble and had made his peace with being the person who showed up to sort it out. He looked at Rourke on the ground first, then at the blood showing through Elias's shirt, then at Rosalie with the Winchester, then at the two sets of retreating hoofprints in the frost-soft ground leading toward the tree line. "Two men rode out," he said. Not a question. "One of Rourke's," Elias said, "and a boy who decided he'd rather not be here." Morrison nodded like that was a reasonable choice. He turned to his deputies, 3 of them, younger men, 2 of whom were watching Rourke with the careful attention of people who recognized him and weren't sure yet what that recognition was going to cost them professionally. The 3rd was already moving to secure Rourke's horse. "Somebody see to his hands," Morrison said, meaning Rourke's wounds. He said it the way you'd say it about any injured animal, not without concern, just without particular warmth. One of the deputies dismounted and came forward with a cloth from his saddlebag. Rourke did not object. He sat in the frozen grass with his wounded shoulder and his ruined gun hand and stared at the ground between his knees with the particular blankness of a man who is not unconscious but is chosen, for the moment, to be unavailable. Morrison turned to Elias. "You're bleeding," he said. "I noticed," Elias said. "How bad?" "Bad enough to need attention, not bad enough to fall down." Morrison studied him for a moment. "There's a woman named Clara Briggs at the settlement 2 hours south. She's better with wounds than anything you'll find in Millhaven." He paused. "Can you ride?" "Yes." Morrison nodded, filed that information, moved on. He looked at Rosalie. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "No," she said. Her voice was steady. She had lowered the Winchester but not set it down. "Are you Rosalie Rourke?" "Rosalie Vane," she said. "I was Rosalie Vane before, and I am Rosalie Vane now." Morrison absorbed that with the expression of a man who had heard this particular distinction made before and understood its significance. "All right, Miss Vane, I'm going to need both of you to tell me what happened here, start to finish." He looked at the sky. Thin cloud, flat light, the sun already past its midday position. "I'd prefer to do it somewhere that isn't a frozen field." They went inside the cabin. Morrison's deputies stayed outside with Rourke, who had allowed himself to be helped to a seated position against the cabin's exterior wall, his hands bandaged roughly, his face still carrying that odd blankness. Inside, Morrison sat at the table and produced a small notebook from his coat pocket and a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was barely 3 inches long. He set these down without ceremony and looked at Elias and Rosalie and said, "Start wherever it starts." Elias started with the deed. He laid it on the table between them, and Morrison looked at it without touching it, reading it where it sat. "Finch," Morrison said. "Garrett Finch." "You know him?" Elias said. "I know of him." Something moved through Morrison's voice, not quite contempt, more like the weary recognition of a familiar pattern. "Land agent. Works the margins mostly. Buys up distressed properties and resells them to people who can't afford to be picky." He looked at Elias. "You bought this place without seeing it." "I did." "And arrived to find it occupied." "By me," Rosalie said. "I'd been here 6 weeks. I was using it as shelter. I knew it was abandoned. I didn't know it had been sold." "And Rourke followed you here?" "He found me, yes. Yesterday afternoon and again this morning." She paused. "He had a marriage certificate. He claimed legal right to take me and the child." Morrison picked up his pencil. "What did that certificate say exactly?" "That we were married in Harmon County. It's real. It was filed legally. But the circumstances under which I signed it—" She stopped. Began again. "My father owed a debt to men who worked for Rourke." Caleb came to our house and offered to settle the debt in exchange for the marriage. My father accepted. I was not consulted until the morning of the ceremony. Morrison wrote something. His pencil moved slowly, deliberately, the handwriting of a man who took notes to remember things, not to perform the act of note-taking. How old were you? 29. And you consented at the ceremony? Rosalie was quiet for a moment. I said the words. Whether that constitutes consent given the circumstances, I don't know. That's a question for someone with more legal knowledge than I have. It's a question for a judge, Morrison said without particular expression. What I can tell you is that coercion in the formation of a marriage contract is grounds for annulment in this territory if it can be demonstrated. Can it be demonstrated? There were witnesses to the arrangement between Caleb and my father, she said. Whether any of them are still alive and willing to speak is another matter. Caleb is very good at ensuring that people who could damage him are either gone or disinclined to speak. Morrison wrote something else. Then he looked up at Elias. You said Rourke admitted killing your brother. In front of Marsh and the young rider, Elias said. Whether either of them will repeat it under oath is the question. The boy might, Morrison said, surprising both of them slightly. In my experience, young men who ride with bad actors do so because they don't understand what they're riding into until something like this morning happens. After something like this morning, they sometimes find their conscience, he paused, or their self-preservation instinct, which amounts to the same thing legally. He looked at Elias carefully. You said he told you Nathan Crowder came to him 3 weeks before his death. Told him he had papers. Records of land transactions, stolen deeds, witness statements. That's what Rourke said Nathan told him. And you believe those papers exist? Elias reached into his breast pocket and took out the folded map and set it on the table. Morrison looked at it. He didn't touch it. He read it where it lay, the way he'd read the deed, and then he looked at the pocket watch sitting next to it. Elias had taken it out at the same time, some instinct to lay all of it down at once. And then he looked at Elias. This was inside the watch, Elias said, hidden in a second space in the case. I didn't know it was there until this morning. Your brother made this map. His handwriting. Morrison picked up the map then, carefully, holding it by the edges. He studied it for a long moment. He looked at the notations, the landmarks, the careful measured distances that were so completely Nathan. Nathan, who had surveyed his own property lines himself, rather than pay someone to do it, who had kept accounts in a ledger so precise you could reconstruct any given week from any given year with perfect accuracy, who had been, as Elias had said, the careful one. The overhang, Morrison said, reading the label Nathan had written at the final landmark before the X. He looked up. I know this country some. There's a rock formation north of here, maybe a day's ride fits that description. He set the map down. If what's there is what your brother told Rourke he had, it could be significant. He paused. It could also be nothing. A man under threat exaggerating his position. Nathan didn't exaggerate, Elias said. Morrison looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of a man who decides to take another man's word on a specific point about a specific person. I'll ride up there myself, Morrison said. Tomorrow, with 2 men. Whatever's there, I'll bring it back and we'll see what it amounts to. He began to close his notebook and then stopped. One more thing. Rourke said something to you about information. About Miss Vane having information he wanted. He said she'd overheard conversations, Elias said. Things that could cause him inconvenience. Morrison turned to Rosalie. What did you hear? She had been waiting for this. He could tell. She had been sitting with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her back straight, and her face carrying the careful expression of a person who has rehearsed telling a truth they know will be difficult to tell. She took a breath. I heard conversations over 3 years, she said. Some of them clearly, some of them in pieces. I'll tell you what I know with certainty and what I'm less sure of, and you can sort out which is which. She paused. The clearest thing I heard, clearly enough that I could repeat it word for word, was a conversation between Caleb and a man named Felder. I never knew his first name. He was a lawyer who came to the house several times. They were discussing a series of land transfers in the eastern part of the county, properties that had been purchased under what they described as accelerated conditions. Caleb laughed when he said it. Accelerated conditions. I understood later what that meant. It meant the owners had been pressured into selling, made to be afraid, made to believe they had no choice. Morrison's pencil had started moving again. How many properties? He said. I heard specific numbers on 2 occasions. The first time 9. The second time the number was 14. She kept her voice flat, factual. Whether those were the same properties or different ones counted differently, I don't know, Morrison wrote. Did not look up. There was another conversation, Rosalie continued, about a judge. I didn't hear his name clearly. I was at the top of the stairs. They were in the study below. But they discussed a payment, a specific sum, to ensure that a particular property case was decided in Caleb's favor. Morrison's pencil stopped. He looked up. His face had not changed, or rather, it had changed in the specific way that people's faces change when they receive information that shifts the scale of what they're dealing with. The same shape, but heavier somehow, as if what he'd been told had physical weight. A judge, he said. Yes. You're certain? I'm certain I heard the word. I'm certain I heard a number said twice, and Caleb confirming it. She met Morrison's eyes. I know how that sounds. I know what it means to say that without more evidence. But you asked me what I heard, and that's what I heard. Morrison set his pencil down on the table. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, they could hear one of the deputies saying something low to Rourke, and Rourke not answering. All right, Morrison said finally. He said it slowly, in the tone of a man taking stock of an inventory that is much larger than the shelf he'd expected to need. All right. He picked up the pencil again and made a final note and closed the notebook. Here's where we are. Rourke is going to Millhaven in custody. The charge right now is assault. He drew on you, he looked at Elias, which your wound corroborates and which Miss Vane witnessed. That's enough to hold him while we investigate the rest. He looked at the map on the table. I'll go up to those mountains. I'll see what Nathan Crowder left there. If it's what it sounds like it might be, the charges are going to expand considerably. He paused. I need both of you to stay in this county. I need you available to speak to what you've told me today, formally, in front of witnesses. I'm not going anywhere, Elias said. Morrison looked at Rosalie. I'm not going anywhere either, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not just compliance, but something more settled and deliberate, like a statement about more than just geography. Morrison stood. He tucked the notebook back into his coat pocket and picked up his pencil, and seemed for a moment to want to say something that wasn't in the official register of his profession. Then he appeared to think better of it, or perhaps just couldn't find the right words. And instead he said, Get that wound seen to, Mr. Crowder. I'll be back inside the week. He picked up the map from the table, carefully, and folded it along Nathan's original creases. I'll keep this. I know, Elias said. Morrison went outside. Elias heard him speaking to his deputies, and the sound of Rourke being helped to his feet, and the protest of saddle leather as people mounted, and the slow departure of hoofbeats across the clearing heading south. Then the clearing was quiet. Truly quiet. In a way it hadn't been since Elias had ridden into the valley 4 days ago, with nothing but a piece of paper and a dying plan. He sat at the table and became aware, in the full and specific way he'd been successfully ignoring for the past several hours, of the wound in his side. It was not minor. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and the shirt was stiff and dark from mid-rib to waistband. And when he moved wrong, there was a deep tearing pull to it that told him the graze was deeper than a graze and needed more attention than he'd given it. Rosalie was already beside him. She hadn't asked. She'd gone to the small trunk at the foot of the bed and produced a linen shirt, one of her own things, he realized, which she tore with efficient ruthlessness into strips, without any visible reluctance about ruining it, and she came back to the table with the strips and a tin cup of water heated on the fire. Take off your coat, she said. I'm fine, he said, which was such an automatic and transparent lie that she didn't even bother responding to it. She just waited with the cloth and the cup. He took off the coat. The shirt underneath told its own story. She helped him ease it off the wound without pulling, which required patience and a specific kind of careful attention that she applied without drama or unnecessary comment. When she saw the wound itself, 2 inches long, following the lower curve of his right rib, deep enough to have laid the underlying tissue open, she made a small sound that she immediately stopped making. It needs closing, she said. I know. I have thread. And a needle, the kind for heavy cloth. I've never stitched a wound, but I've stitched enough other things. She paused. This is going to hurt. I know, he said again. You don't have to pretend it won't. He looked at her. I know that too. She cleaned it first, which hurt in the straightforward physical way. Then she threaded the needle by the window light, her fingers steady in a way that his probably wouldn't have been in her position, and she came back to him and said, "Ready?" in a voice that made it less a question than a courtesy. "Do it," he said. She did it. He did not pretend it didn't hurt. She worked in silence, focused and precise. And when she was done, she tied the thread and cut it with a small knife and sat back and looked at her work with the critical expression of someone who knows the difference between good enough and actually good and is deciding which category they've achieved. "It'll hold if you don't do anything stupid," she said. "Define stupid," he said. "Getting shot again," she said. He laughed. It hurt to laugh, which was its own information about the wound, and she gave him a look that communicated clearly that she did not find it funny, and he stopped laughing. She wrapped his ribs with the remaining strips of linen and tied them firmly and helped him ease into his coat. And when she was done, she sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table and looked out the window at the empty clearing for a long moment. "He's actually gone," she said. "For now," Elias said. "Until the trial. There'll be a trial. With what Morrison's going to find in those mountains, there'll be more than one." He paused. "He's not coming back here as a free man, Rosalie, whatever else happens." She was quiet. Not the relieved quiet of a person who has been waiting for good news and finally received it. Something more complicated than that. The quiet of a person discovering that the thing they've been afraid of for so long has left a shape in them, and the shape doesn't immediately go away just because the cause of it is gone. "My father," she said. "Caleb controlled the money that was meant to settle the estate after he died. There wasn't much, but there was something. The house, some tools. I never saw any of it." She stopped. "It doesn't matter now. I know it doesn't. It matters," Elias said. "It won't come back. No, but it still matters that it was taken." She looked at him. She had the look again, the cataloging look, but it had changed from the first time she'd used it in the cabin doorway. That first look had been assessment. Is this man dangerous? Is this man going to make things worse? This was something else. Something more like recognition, the way you look at something when you've realized it's a different thing than you thought it was. "Why did you stay?" she said. "Yesterday. You could have looked at the situation and decided it wasn't worth it. A cabin you'd never seen before, a woman you'd just met, 3 armed men who were clearly going to be trouble." She tilted her head slightly. "I've been trying to understand it, the practical logic of it." Elias thought about what his father had told him about fence posts and ground. He thought about the 11 minutes at the auction. He thought about Nathan's letter arriving 3 days after the funeral, and the feeling of opening it, the specific horror of reading a dead man's casual future tense. "My brother came to Rourke," he said, "with evidence, trying to do the right thing through proper channels, trying to make the bad man understand that his time was finished." He looked at his hands on the table, and Rourke killed him for it, quietly and neatly, and in a way that couldn't be proven. He paused. "I've spent 7 months being angry about that and not being able to do anything with the anger because I had no proof and no witness and nowhere to point it." He looked at her. "And then I opened a door and found someone who needed help, and the man who had taken everything from her was the same man who took everything from Nathan. And sometimes the world just lines things up that way. Not neatly, not with any kind of plan to it. Just the same thing you've been carrying for months turns out to be connected to something someone else has been carrying." He stopped. "I couldn't walk away from that." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "That's not entirely practical logic," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." The afternoon moved. The light through the cabin window went from flat white to pale gold as the cloud thinned and the sun found the gap before it dropped behind the western ridge. The fire burned low and Elias fed it, moving carefully, his side reminding him with every reach and twist that it was there and intended to remain the center of his attention for a while. They ate. The bread was gone, but there was dried venison and the last of the potatoes and some dried apples Elias found in his saddlebag that he hadn't eaten on the trail and had forgotten about entirely. They put it all in the pot with water and some salt and made something that was not quite stew and not quite anything else, and ate it without complaint because they were both hungry enough to find it good. "The settlement Morrison mentioned," Rosalie said, eating slowly. "Clara Briggs. I went through there, on my way here. She's a midwife, among other things. Morrison said wounds. She does both. Rosalie turned the spoon in her bowl. I'll need someone. When the time comes. Elias looked at her. He'd been aware of this in the peripheral way a man who has no particular experience with such things is aware of it, present in the back of his mind, an urgency with a timeline he couldn't precisely calculate. How long? He said. 6 weeks, maybe. Maybe 8? It's hard to be certain. She said it matter-of-factly, but her hand moved to her side briefly, an unconscious gesture, the instinctive check of someone monitoring something important. We should get you there before the trial, he said. The trial could be months away. Then we go soon anyway. To let her look at you. To make sure things are... He stopped, aware that he didn't have the vocabulary for what he was trying to say. All right, she said. In a few days, when you can ride without reopening that. She nodded toward his side. They fell back into quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines with the low, persistent sound that was either peaceful or watchful, depending on the state of mind you brought to it. The cabin needs work, Rosalie said. He looked at her. The east wall, she said, nodding in that direction. There's a gap forming between 2 of the logs, up near the roofline. I've been stuffing it with cloth, but it's not a real fix. And the barn... She stopped. Have you looked at the barn? Not yet. The roof is mostly sound, but one wall has shifted on the foundation. I noticed it when I arrived. It won't stand through a hard winter. Elias considered the ceiling above them, the walls around them, all the things that had been quietly deteriorating through years of no one living here, and no one caring, and the mountain doing what mountains do to structures left unattended. It's fixable, he said. Most things are, she said, if you start soon enough. He looked at her across the small table with the pot between them and the fire making its light against the rough-hewn walls, and he thought that he had come to this cabin looking for a beginning and had found something considerably more complicated than a beginning, and also something that was, despite the complications, distinctly and stubbornly alive in a way that the life he'd been living for the past year had not been. 2 days later, Morrison's deputy came back. Elias was on the east wall with a handful of mud and moss chinking, working the gap that Rosalie had identified, moving carefully because his side would not yet permit him to move any other way, when the rider came down from the ridge at a pace that meant news rather than courtesy call. The deputy was young, not the same one who had been at the clearing during the confrontation, a different one, with a sharp face and tired eyes, and he tied his horse at the creek and came across the clearing removing his hat. Mr. Crowder? He said. Elias came down from where he was working and waited. Sheriff Morrison sent me ahead, the deputy said. He's still in the mountains. He found the location your brother's map indicated. Elias felt something shift inside his chest. And? He said. The deputy blew out a breath. Not dramatically, just the particular exhale of someone who has been carrying information and is relieved to set it down. There's a tin box, he said, sealed with wax, buried under a flat rock shelf at the back of the overhang your brother marked. He paused. Inside are documents. Deeds. The sheriff counted 11 so far, with other people's names on them and Rourke's endorsement forged over top. There are letters, statements, written and signed from 3 different people, and there are financial records. He stopped. Mr. Crowder, there are financial records that name a circuit judge. Elias was very still. Which judge? He said. The deputy told him. It was a name Elias recognized distantly from years ago, a man who had tried a land case in his county, a case that the losing party had complained loudly was decided wrong, in which the complaints had eventually died away. The way complaints do when the person making them runs out of money and energy and nowhere to appeal. Morrison's bringing everything back, the deputy continued. He'll be here by tomorrow afternoon if the trail holds. He paused again. There's one more thing. The statements in the box. One of them is from a man named Briggs, first name Theodore. He attests that he witnessed Caleb Rourke instruct a man named Cade to follow Nathan Crowder and ensure that he did not reach Millhaven. The deputy looked at Elias carefully. He attests that Cade reported back that the job was done. The wind came through the pines. The creek made its sound. Rosalie had come out of the cabin at some point during this, drawn by some instinct, and she stood near the porch watching Elias's face. She didn't speak. She just watched. Elias put his hand on the east wall of the cabin, the wall he'd been chinked the gap in, and felt the old wood under his palm, solid and cold and real. Nathan knew someone would come looking, Elias said. Not to the deputy, not to Rosalie, just said it to the wall, to the air. He knew that if something happened to him, it had to go somewhere safe, somewhere that could only be found if you knew what to look for. He stopped. He hid the map in the watch on purpose. He knew that watch would come to me. He thought about Nathan, careful Nathan, sending the watch to a neighbor's keeping before he rode to Rourke's house for that final meeting, knowing that the meeting was dangerous, and that if it went wrong, the watch would eventually reach Elias, and that Elias would look at the back of it properly because Elias had been the one, as a boy, who had first discovered the secret compartment in the case. A childhood discovery, decades old, that Nathan had turned into a dead man's message. His eyes burned. He did not look at Rosalie or the deputy. He looked at the wall, and he breathed, and he let the moment be what it was. "Thank you," he said to the deputy. "Tell Morrison we'll be here." The deputy remounted and rode back up the trail, and the sound of the hoofbeats climbed the ridge and disappeared, and Elias stood with his hand on the cold cabin wall until the sound was fully gone. Rosalie came and stood beside him, not touching him, just beside him. "He kept his promise," she said quietly. "Your brother. Whatever he told Rourke he'd made sure it was real and safe and reachable." "Yes," Elias said. "He protected people he'd never even met, families who'd lost their land, people Rourke had run over." She paused. "That kind of person doesn't come along very often." Elias took the silver watch from his breast pocket and looked at it, the hand still frozen at 4:17. The back closed now, the secret space behind it empty. He turned it in his fingers once, the way he had 100 times on the trail, and he thought about Nathan at 22, teaching him to read a survey line. Nathan at 30, writing their mother's name in the front of the family Bible in his careful, steady hand. Nathan in a letter, a little crooked at the end from tiredness, saying, "I'm having trouble with a man named Rourke." He put the watch back. "I need to go to Millhaven," he said, "when Morrison gets back. I need to be there for whatever comes next." "I know," Rosalie said. "Will you be all right here for the time it takes?" She turned and looked at the cabin, at the east wall with its repaired chinking, at the cleared porch, at the windows she'd kept clean, at the barn visible behind and to the right with its shifted wall that needed fixing. "I've been all right here for 6 weeks by myself," she said. "That's not the same situation as—" "No," she said, "it isn't. But Rourke is in custody. His men have scattered, and Morrison's men are going to be moving through this territory for the foreseeable future." She paused. "I'll be fine. Go do what needs doing." He looked at her. "I'll be back," he said. She didn't say, "Of course you will," or "I know you will," or any of the easy, reassuring things that people say. She just looked at him, the way she'd looked at him since the beginning, directly, without pretense, with the specific, clear-eyed attention of a person who has learned not to take things on faith, but is making a considered decision to trust them anyway. "The east wall still needs more work past that one gap," she said. "There's a place on the roof I couldn't reach, and the well rope is fraying." He almost laughed. He stopped himself. "I'll fix them when I get back," he said. "Yes," she said, "you will." He went inside and packed what he needed for the trail, and outside the cabin the pines stood against the cold sky, and the creek kept moving, and Rosalie stood on the porch until he was across the clearing and into the trees, and she watched the place where he'd gone for a long moment after he'd disappeared. Then she went inside and put wood on the fire and sat down at the table in the cabin that had started as a hiding place and was becoming something she did not yet have the right word for, and she waited for whatever came next. The road to Millhaven was 4 days of cold. Elias rode with Morrison and 2 deputies, and he spent most of those 4 days not talking, which suited everyone, including the sheriff, who was a man who understood that some stretches of a difficult thing needed to be ridden through quietly. The tin box from Nathan's hiding place rode in Morrison's saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, and Elias was aware of it. The way you're aware of something important that is traveling alongside you, not looking at it constantly, but never entirely forgetting it was there. His side hurt, not the disabling, white-edged pain of the first day, but the grinding, persistent hurt of healing tissue that objects to the motion of a horse and makes its objection known every hour without fail. He rode through it because there was no alternative and because it gave him something concrete to manage,
which was better than spending 4 days entirely inside his own head. On the second night, camped at a creek crossing Morrison knew, the sheriff sat across the fire from Elias and said, without preamble, "The judge." Elias looked at him.
"His name is Aldous Crane," Morrison said. "Circuit judge, been riding this territory for 11 years. I've appeared before him a dozen times. Never had reason to question his decisions, or—" He stopped. Considered. "Or I had reason and didn't act on it, which amounts to the same failure." He stared at the fire. "The records in your brother's box are specific. 2 payments, both documented with dates and amounts. One before a ruling on a property case. The Hendersons lost their ranch 4 years ago. Family's been scattered since. One before a ruling on a water rights case." He paused. "Crane's going to say the documents are forgeries." "Will he be believed?" Elias said. "For a while," Morrison said. "These things take time. They require a territorial judge with no conflict, which means bringing someone in from outside. They require witnesses who aren't afraid." He looked across the fire at Elias. "The statements in that box, the one from Theodore Briggs about Nathan, that one has teeth. That one names a specific act and a specific person who carried it out." He paused. "Finding Cade is going to matter." "Who is he?" "Don't know yet, but Rourke kept records the way men who distrust everyone keep records, as insurance against the people they use. If Cade is in those documents somewhere, we'll find him." Morrison poked the fire. "I've been a sheriff for 16 years. I have never worked a case that unraveled as fast as this one is going to unravel. When you pull one thread on something like what Rourke built, and the thread is as long as the one your brother left, everything comes undone at once." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Nathan went to him," Elias said, "directly to Rourke, with all of it." He shook his head slowly. "I've tried to understand that. Nathan was careful. He wasn't naive. Why would he? He probably thought it was the merciful thing," Morrison said. "Give the man a chance to go quietly, rather than face what was coming." He paused. "Some people believe that even the worst ones deserve a door to walk out of before you bring the walls down. Rourke walked him into a ravine instead." "Yes." Morrison's voice was flat. "That's what happens sometimes when you offer a door to a man who's never believed any door was meant for him." He looked at Elias. "Your brother wasn't wrong to try. He was wrong about what Rourke would do with the offer. Those aren't the same mistake." Elias turned that over for a while. He'd been angry at Nathan for it. In the private, unexamined way you're angry at someone you love for getting themselves killed. An anger with no legitimate target that had been sitting in his chest for 7 months, looking for somewhere to land. Morrison's distinction didn't dissolve the anger, but it moved it slightly, shifted it off Nathan, and back toward the place it belonged. They reached Millhaven on the 4th day at mid-afternoon. It was larger than Elias had expected. A real town, not a settlement, with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, and a courthouse with an actual second story, and a hotel that had glass in all its windows. The kind of town that had been there long enough to develop opinions about itself. Rourke had been held at the county jail since the day Morrison's deputies had brought him in. He'd had his wounds properly treated, the shoulder and the hand, and he'd had 3 days alone in a cell, which was, Elias thought, probably the most genuinely alone Caleb Rourke had ever been in his adult life. Elias did not go to see him. Morrison spent the next 2 days in meetings that Elias was not part of, with county officials, with a lawyer who had ridden down from the territorial capital to review the contents of Nathan's tin box, with a man Elias never saw but whose arrival caused a visible shift in Morrison's deputies, a sharpening of attention that suggested someone of consequence had come to town. On the evening of the second day, Morrison came to the hotel room Elias had taken and sat down in the single chair and said, "The territorial attorney is here. He's reviewed everything. He's filing charges tomorrow." "How many charges?" Elias said. Morrison counted on his fingers. It took a while. When he was done, Elias sat with that for a moment. "And the judge?" he said. "Crane?" "Suspended pending investigation. The territorial court is sending someone else to handle everything related to Rourke." Morrison looked at his hands. "It's going to be a long process. Months, probably more. There are families who lost land, tracking them down, reconstructing what was taken, figuring out what can be returned and what can't." He paused. "Some of those families have been gone 4, 5 years. Scattered. Some of the land has changed hands again since Rourke got it. untangling all of that. He blew out a breath. It's not going to be clean. It never is, Elias said. No. Morrison stood. Your testimony will be needed, formally, on record. The territorial attorney wants to speak with you tomorrow morning. He started toward the door and then stopped. Miss Vane's testimony will matter considerably. What she heard, what she witnessed during the marriage. The attorney is going to want to speak with her as well. I'll bring her, Elias said, when the time comes. There's one more thing. Morrison reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he set on the small table beside the door. The marriage. I spoke to the attorney about the circumstances Miss Vane described. He's of the opinion that the coercion claim is solid, particularly given what the documents show about Rourke's pattern of using debt as leverage. He nodded at the paper. That's the preliminary filing for annulment. She'll need to sign it, and there will be a formal proceeding, but the attorney doesn't anticipate significant obstacles. Elias looked at the paper. Thank you, he said. Morrison put on his hat. You did right, he said, standing on that porch. I know that's not the kind of thing I usually say, but he stopped, seemingly a little uncomfortable with where the sentence had taken him. Somebody needed to. He left. Elias sat in the chair the sheriff had vacated and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room and thought about Rosalie back at the cabin, alone, the fire going, the well-rope fraying. He thought about what Morrison had said, somebody needed to, and what it meant that the somebody had been him, an exhausted man with $300 and a failed ranch and nothing better to do than buy a cabin site unseen and ride toward a new beginning that turned out to be something else entirely. He testified the next morning. It took 3 hours, and the territorial attorney was a precise and relentless man who went through everything twice and took notes that he then read back for confirmation, and by the end of it, Elias's side was aching badly from sitting rigid in a hard chair for so long, and he was as tired as he'd been after the gunfight, which was a different kind of tired but not less real. He rode back to the cabin the following morning. He pushed the pace and made it in 3 days, the wound protesting steadily and being steadily ignored. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he came down the switchback trail into the valley and saw the smoke from the chimney, and Cutter picked up his pace without being asked, some animal understanding of returning. Rosalie was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he came across the clearing. She heard the horse and straightened and watched him cross the grass with the expression of a person who has been alone long enough to have made her peace with it, and is now having to make a quick adjustment in the other direction. She did not say, "I was worried," or "I'm glad you're back." She looked him over, assessed the damage to his posture, registered that he was moving slightly better than when he'd left, and said, "The roof." He looked at her. "There's a section over the north corner," she said. "It held through the wind 2 nights ago, but it won't hold again. I got up there to look at it." "You got on the roof," he said. "I was careful." "You are 7 months pregnant." "I was very careful." She turned back to the firewood. "It needs new shingles on a 6-foot section. I found shingles in the barn that'll do." He stood there for a moment, looking at the back of her head, at the competent economical motion of the axe coming down. He thought about trying to say something about the roof and pregnant women and the specific definition of careful. He thought about how well that conversation was likely to go. "I'll do the roof tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. He took care of the horse, and when he came back to the cabin, she had food going and the fire built up, and they sat across from each other at the table in the lamplight, and he told her everything. Morrison, the territorial attorney, the charges, the annulment filing. She was quiet through most of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a little longer. 11 families, she said, meaning the deeds, the stolen land. At minimum, he said, Morrison thinks there may be more that Nathan didn't have documented. She turned her spoon in her bowl. The Henderson family, Morrison mentioned them. Their land was taken 4 years ago. I remember Caleb mentioning a Henderson. I didn't know the context then. She stopped. I wonder where they went. Morrison's looking, Elias said. All of them. The process of finding them and figuring out what can be returned is going to take time, but it's started. Some of them won't come back, she said, even if they could. 4 years in someone else's life, people put down new roots. Some of them will, he said. She nodded. She seemed to be doing the particular arithmetic of damage, the kind that doesn't have clean answers, where you add up what was taken and subtract what can be returned and accept that the remainder is something you carry rather than something you resolve. The annulment, she said. The attorney says it'll go through without difficulty. She reached out and picked up the folded paper he'd set on the table when he came in. She held it without opening it. I've been Rosalie Rourke for 3 years, she said. Legally, on paper. She turned the folded paper over in her hands. I've been Rosalie Vane in my own head every single day. But there's a difference between what you call yourself in your own head and what the world calls you. She paused. I want my name back. I want it back in writing, officially, permanently. You'll have it, he said. She set the paper down. She looked at him across the table. Outside, the wind came through the pines, and the creek made its sound, and the fire shifted, and the cabin held its warmth against the cold outside in the way solid old things do, not perfectly, but well enough. You fixed the east wall, she said. He hadn't noticed until now that she'd noticed. The work he'd done before Millhaven, the chinked gap, the careful filling. It needed doing, he said. Yes. She looked around the cabin, the walls, the ceiling, the small repairs accumulating, the slowly improving shape of a place that had been abandoned and was no longer abandoned. There's a lot more that needs doing. I know, he said. I've got time. She looked at him. A direct look, fully present, neither the first careful cataloging look nor the subsequent layered versions of it, but something that had resolved into its final form, the look of a woman who has decided something and is comfortable having decided it. You're planning to stay, she said. This is my land, he said. Deed says so. That's not what I mean. I know, he said. Yes, I'm planning to stay. She nodded, once, as if that confirmed something she had already largely worked out. The barn wall, she said. The shifted one. I know about the barn wall. And the well rope. I ordered a new well rope from a man in town. It'll come with the next supply wagon. She almost smiled. Not quite. It was the same ghost of a thing it had always been, present for a moment and then gone. But it was there. 3 weeks later, Rosalie went into labor on a Thursday morning before dawn. Elias had been awake already. His side, mostly healed now but stiff in the cold, had woken him at some point in the early darkness, and he'd been sitting at the table with coffee and the kind of thinking you do at 3 in the morning when there's nothing productive to think about, and you do it anyway. He heard her from across the cabin, a sound that was not quite a sound, more of a held breath that broke, and then her voice, very controlled, saying his name. He was beside her in a second. It's time, she said. Unnecessary information, delivered with the specific clarity of a person who has decided that clarity is the most useful thing they can offer in this particular situation. He had planned for this. He'd ridden to Clara Briggs's settlement 2 weeks earlier, the woman Morrison had mentioned, the midwife who also did wounds, and had made arrangements, and Clara had told him what to do if the time came before he could reach her, and he had listened carefully and repeated it back, and she had corrected 2 things and had him repeat it again. He did what Clara had told him. The labor was long, not dangerous, though there were hours in the middle of it when he could not have told you the difference between long and dangerous because fear has a way of blurring that distinction. But long, grinding, the kind of labor that requires the person doing it to go deep into some private resource that no one else can access for them. Rosalie did not ask him to leave the cabin. She did not ask him to do anything except at specific moments when she needed specific things, and at those moments she asked precisely and waited until they were done. She made sounds that were difficult to hear, and he heard them without flinching, because flinching would have been about his own discomfort rather than hers. At mid-morning, a daughter arrived. She was small and red and furious about the whole situation and announced her opinion of it at significant volume, and Elias, who had assisted with the birth of a great many calves and foals and lambs over the course of his life and thought he was therefore somewhat prepared for this, discovered that he was not at all prepared for this, and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, with his hands shaking slightly, and looked at this small, furious person and felt something happen in his chest that had no name he was aware of. Rosalie held her daughter and looked at her with an expression that Elias could not describe and would not have tried to. It was private. It was hers. He looked away and gave it to her. After a while, Rosalie said, "She's loud." "Yes," he said. "Good," Rosalie said. Clara Briggs arrived 3 hours later. She'd been told to expect the summons and had started writing at first light when it didn't come, acting on some instinct that turned out to be correct. She examined Rosalie efficiently and thoroughly and declared that everything was as it should be. And she looked at the baby with the professional assessment of a woman who had seen several hundred of them, and her face did the thing that experienced midwives' faces do, a private satisfaction that is not quite a smile. "What's her name?" Clara asked. Rosalie looked at the baby. She had been looking at her steadily since she arrived, with the concentrated attention of someone memorizing something important. "Nora," Rosalie said. "Nora Vane." Clara nodded and wrote it in her record book. She stayed the night, which Elias was grateful for, and in the morning she gave Rosalie instructions and left a supply of things and rode back to her settlement, and the cabin went back to its quiet, which was now a different quiet than it had been, inhabited, specifically and permanently inhabited, by a small person who had views about hunger and comfort and the cold and expressed those views without reservation. Elias fixed the roof that week. He fixed the barn wall the week after. The well rope arrived with the supply wagon, and he replaced it on a cold morning while Rosalie sat on the porch in a heavy coat with Nora wrapped against her chest, watching him work with a critical attention that suggested she had opinions about the knot he was using. "That knot," she said. "It's fine," he said. "My father used a different one." "Your father, with respect, also borrowed money he couldn't pay back." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. The months moved. November became December, and the snow came and the cabin held, and they developed the particular domestic routine of two people who had not planned to share a space and are therefore without the usual assumptions about who does what, and worked it out practically and imperfectly, and with occasional disagreement that was direct and unromantic, and therefore, in its way, more honest than most households managed. Elias built a partition in the cabin. Not a full wall, just enough to give Rosalie some privacy, something she had mentioned once, carefully, without asking for it. He built it over 3 days while she was outside with Nora in the thin winter light, and when she came back in and saw it, she looked at it for a moment and said nothing, and the way she said nothing told him everything he needed to know about whether it was the right thing to do. In January, a letter came with the supply wagon from Morrison. Short, direct, in the sheriff's practical handwriting. Rourke had been formally charged on 9 counts. The trial was set for spring. 3 of his former associates had agreed to cooperate with the territorial attorney in exchange for reduced charges, and among the information they had provided was the full name of the man called Cade, Harlan Cade, a man with his own record, currently located in a town 2 counties south, where Morrison's counterpart had him in custody. The Cade matter, Morrison wrote, would proceed separately but in connection with the Rourke case, and the charge was murder, specifically the murder of Nathan Crowder. Elias read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the tin box he'd set aside on the shelf above the fireplace. A plain tin box, nothing like the one from the mountain, just something he'd found in the barn, which now held the documents that were his and Rosalie's to keep, the deed to the property, the annulment papers signed and returned with an official stamp, a letter from the territorial court confirming that the annulment had been granted, and Nathan's silver watch. He did not put the letter away immediately. He sat at the table with it and looked at it, specifically at the line about Harlan Cade and the charge of murder. He thought about Nathan in that ravine. He'd thought about it so many times in so many ways, with anger, with grief, with the grinding, helpless rage of a man who knows something is wrong and cannot prove it. He'd thought about it so often that the image had worn smooth, the way a stone wears smooth in moving water. He thought about it now differently, not resolved. He knew better than to call it resolved. Nathan was still dead. Cade in custody and Rourke on trial didn't undo that and never would. You don't get the person back. That is the permanent and immovable fact at the center of any story that involves losing someone. That the loss is actual and the thing lost is gone, and the process of justice, as necessary as it is, does not touch that specific wound. But Nathan's records were out of that tin box in the mountain. They were in the hands of people who could act on them. 11 families had a path back to what they'd lost. A corrupt judge was suspended. A killer was in custody. And Caleb Rourke, who had ridden into a clearing 4 months ago on a black horse with the absolute confidence of a man to whom the world had never said no, was going to stand in front of a territorial court and answer for things he had believed he would never answer for. Nathan had known. He had done his careful work and hidden it carefully and trusted, against all the evidence of how things had gone for him personally, that the evidence would survive him and reach the people who needed it. He'd been right. Elias folded the letter and put it in the box and closed the lid. Rosalie was feeding Nora in the chair by the fire. She had the particular half-absent expression of new mothers doing this task. Present, but internal. A portion of her attention in some private place. She looked up when he closed the box. "Good news or complicated news?" she said. "Both," he said. "Kate is in custody, charged with Nathan's murder." She was quiet for a moment. "That's as close to justice as it comes." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the fire. Nora made a small sound, and Rosalie adjusted, and the small sound stopped. "Rourke's trial is in spring," he said. "Will you have to go?" "To testify, yes." She nodded. "I'll have to go too." "I know." "We'll go together then." He looked at her. Something about the way she said it, the matter-of-fact simplicity of it, "we'll go together," reached him in a way that more elaborate statements had not. Not because it was tender, particularly. Because it was practical. Because it treated the two of them as a unit without making an announcement out of it. The way people who have genuinely decided something treat it, as a settled fact rather than a declaration. "Yes," he said, "we will." The spring came slowly, the way it does in mountain country. Not as an arrival, but as a reluctant permission. Winter releasing its hold degree by degree. The snow pulling back from the clearing in daily increments. The creek running harder and louder with snowmelt. The pines showing the first tentative green of new growth at their tips. Elias repaired the fence line along the eastern edge of the property. He brought in 4 cows and a bull from a man in the settlement. The beginning of the small herd he'd imagined on the trail northeast. The modest practical hope he'd been carrying since the day of the auction. They were not impressive animals. They were what he could afford, which was not the same thing but was what he had to work with. Rosalie planted a garden along the south side of the clearing, exactly where Elias had imagined it, the strip of ground that got the most sun, which she'd identified independently, and for the same reason. She worked it in sections, a little at a time, because Nora was 4 months old and required interruption, and the garden accordingly looked patchy and improvised and nothing like the neat rows that appeared in the seed catalogs, and she seemed entirely unbothered by this. One morning in April, Elias was working on the fence along the north edge when he heard a horse on the trail and straightened to look. The rider was alone, coming down slowly, and as he came into the clearing, Elias recognized the sharp face of Morrison's deputy, the one who had brought the news about Nathan's box months ago. "Mr. Crowder," the deputy said, pulling up. "What is it?" Elias said. He'd learned, in the months of this, that Morrison's men did not ride 4 days for social calls. "The trial date's been moved up," the deputy said. 2 weeks from Thursday. Attorney wants you and Miss Vane in Millhaven by the Wednesday before." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded paper. "Official summons, for the record, but he said to tell you in person first, so you had time to arrange things." Elias took the paper. "Is there anything else?" "One thing." The deputy hesitated in the way of someone who has been told to deliver information and is working out the best way to do it. Rourke's lawyer made a motion to have the box evidence excluded, the mountain location, chain of custody. He's arguing it wasn't properly obtained. The deputy paused. The motion was denied. Territorial judge reviewed the circumstances and denied it this week. The evidence stands. Elias let out a breath. The attorney also said, the deputy stopped, started again. He said Nathan Crowder put together the most complete and careful record of criminal activity he'd ever seen from a private individual. He said he wanted you to know that. Elias stood with the fence post in one hand and the official summons in the other and looked at the clearing and the cabin and the garden along the south side where Rosalie was working, Nora in a sling across her chest, moving among the improvised rows. "Thank you," he said. "Tell him I heard it." The deputy rode back up the trail. Elias went back to the fence and worked in silence for a while, and then he put down the tools and walked to where Rosalie was working and stood at the edge of the garden. She looked up. He told her about the trial date, about the denied motion, about what the attorney had said about Nathan. She listened. When he finished, she straightened and pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, the kind of gesture that has no calculation in it, just the practical management of inconvenience. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks. She looked down at Nora, who was asleep in the sling with the absolute commitment to sleep that only very young people manage. She looked at the patchy garden. She looked at the cabin. He'll be convicted, she said. Not a wish. A statement, the way she made statements, considered, and then delivered without hedging, because she had decided hedging was a waste of everyone's time. I think so, Elias said. I know so, she said. He built his whole life on the assumption that nothing would ever touch him. Men like that, when it finally touches them, they don't have anything to meet it with, no real foundation. She paused. He'll be convicted, and then it'll be done. It won't be entirely done, Elias said. These things leave, there are families who, I know, she said. I mean done for us. Done in the specific sense of not something we carry as the main thing anymore. She looked at him. It can be something that happened, something that mattered, and that we were part of, but past tense. Behind us. He thought about that. About the difference between the thing that defines you and the thing that happened to you, and how you move the first into the second category, and whether it's a choice or a process or some combination of neither that you only understand in retrospect. I think you're right, he said. I usually am, she said. You're starting to notice. He did almost smile at that. She turned back to her garden before she could see it. They rode to Millhaven on a Wednesday in early May, the weather finally honest about being spring, the trail thawed and manageable, and the mountains at their backs with their white tops catching the light. Rosalie rode with Nora in a carrier across her chest, which she had constructed from cloth, and which Clara Briggs had reviewed and approved, and which Nora appeared to find acceptable. The trial lasted 8 days. Elias testified on the second day, and Rosalie on the fourth. She sat in front of the territorial court and told what she had seen and heard over 3 years of marriage, in the same measured, direct voice she used for everything, without dramatics and without visible fear. And when Rourke's lawyer attempted to undermine her credibility with questions about her father's debts and her motivations, she answered each question simply and waited for the next one and did not give the lawyer what he was looking for, which was a crack, some visible wound he could press on. She did not have one. Or rather, she had them. Elias knew she had them, knew the 3 years had left marks that would not entirely disappear. But they were hers, kept inside where they belonged, and no lawyer in a courtroom had access to them. Rourke looked at her during her testimony. Once, at the beginning, for a long moment. She did not look back at him. She looked at the attorney, at the judge, at the jury, at the wall above the jury, when she needed a moment to gather her phrasing. She looked everywhere except at Caleb Rourke, and that deliberate absence of her gaze, Elias thought, was more powerful than anything a direct look could have been. On the day, the jury returned. It took them 3 hours. Guilty on 7 of 9 counts, including fraud, coercion, and criminal conspiracy. A separate count regarding the forced marriage was sent to a civil proceeding. The Cade matter, Nathan's murder, was a separate trial already scheduled, with Cade's cooperation now confirmed in exchange for a lesser charge, which meant the evidence against Rourke for directing the killing was going to be presented in a courtroom whether Rourke cooperated or not. When the verdict was read, Elias was watching Rourke's face. He'd thought about this moment, about what he would feel, what he would want to see in the man's face, whether there would be something that felt like satisfaction or completion or justice rendered in a visible and satisfying form. What he saw was a man sitting very still, looking at a point on the table in front of him, with an expression that was less devastation than a kind of profound vacancy. As if the verdict had removed something structural, and what remained was just the exterior, the shape of Caleb Rourke, with nothing particular animating it anymore. Not remorse. He was too careful a man for remorse. Just absence. The absence of the thing he had spent his whole life being, which was the most powerful force in any room he occupied. That was not satisfying exactly. It was true, and Elias supposed that truth was what you had to settle for when satisfaction wasn't available. The truth was that Caleb Rourke was going to spend the significant remainder of his life in a territorial prison, and the records Nathan had died protecting had brought down a corrupt judge and freed 11 families, and a man named Cade was going to stand trial for what he'd done in a ravine on a February morning, and the law had done what the law does, slowly and imperfectly, and with costs along the way that could not be recovered, but done it. Rosalie was sitting beside him. She had Nora in her arms, the baby awake now, looking around the courtroom with the undiscriminating attention of someone to whom everything is equally interesting. When the judge finished speaking and the room began its general movement, Rosalie turned to Elias and said quietly, "Let's go home." He looked at her. Home. The cabin in the pine country with the patched east wall and the garden along the south side and the 4 cows he was hoping to grow into something more substantial. The tin box on the shelf above the fireplace with the deed and the watch inside it. The partition he'd built that winter. The well rope he'd replaced. The roof over the north corner that had needed new shingles and had gotten them. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." They rode out of Mill Haven on a Thursday morning, the same direction Elias had first ridden 4 months in a different life ago. North, toward the pine country, toward the ridge with the notch cut in it like a missing tooth that he now knew how to find in his sleep. Rosalie rode beside him, Nora between them in the carrier, the baby's eyes half closed against the light. The morning was cool and clear, and the sky the particular shade of blue that only appears in spring, before the heat comes in and bleaches it. They rode without talking for a while. The trail climbed, the trees closed around them, the familiar smell of pine resin and cold stone and moving water. After a while, Elias said, "The cattle are going to need moving to the north pasture. The grass is probably up by now." "I know," Rosalie said, "and that section of fence I was working when Morrison's deputy came, you didn't finish it," she said. "No. It'll need finishing before the herd gets up there." "I know that." She glanced at him sideways, the brief assessing look that had become familiar. "You're making a list," she said. "I'm thinking about the work," he said. "So am I," she said. "I was thinking about the garden. The beans didn't go in deep enough on the east section, and the squash—" "Rosalie." "What?" He looked at her, at the trail ahead, at the light coming through the pines. At Nora, small and untroubled, listing slightly toward sleep. "We can talk about the beans tomorrow," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We can." They rode on through the pines, and the mountains rose around them, and the trail wound upward toward the valley and the cabin and the 43 acres of timbered land with the creek running along the eastern edge. And none of it was what Elias had imagined when he bought it. Not quieter, not simpler, not the clean blank beginning he'd been trying to purchase with the last of what he had. It was better than that. Not easier. Not what he'd planned. Just better, in the particular way that things become better when they turn out to be alive in ways you didn't anticipate. When the people in them are real and difficult and present. When the ground under you is ground you fought for and chose to keep and know by name. The cabin would be cold when they got there. He'd have to build the fire up. The fence needed finishing. The beans were in wrong. Nora would wake at some point in the night, and the night would be interrupted, and then the morning would come early, the way it always did. He thought about Nathan, about the careful watch, and the careful map, and the careful record of all the wrong that needed righting. About a man who had trusted that the truth would survive him, and had been right, and had never gotten to know that he was right. He thought, "I'll tell you. Someday, in whatever way a living person tells things to someone who is gone, I'll tell you how it came out." The ridge came into view above them, the familiar notch against the sky. Elias Crowder rode toward it, toward the cabin below it, toward everything that waited there. He did not look back.